Star Trek's Mr. Sulu, the galaxy's greatest helmsman, captain, and swordfighter. Actor George Takei originated the role of the Enterprise's helmsman in 1966, and it's a character he's still playing to this day, making him the single longest-serving actor in Star Trek history.
You better believe it.
And although the future depicted by Star Trek is one of peace and freedom, for most of his life, George Takei's reality was the exact opposite. As a little boy in the 1940s, he was taken from his home by the US government and forced to spend his childhood living in a concentration camp.
I could see the barbed wire fence and the sentry towers outside my schoolhouse window as I recited the words, "with liberty and justice for all."
And as an adult, he spent decades hiding a secret that he was sure would destroy his career.
Putting on a facade, and there's always that fear of making a mistake, letting something slip out.
But like his character, George refused to take unfair treatment lying down. First as an actor and then as an activist, he took on some of the most powerful people and institutions in the world in a fight against inequality.
It was terrifying.
And not only was he successful beyond his wildest dreams,
That was one of the happiest moments in my life.
but his journey from concentration camp to space to real-life fight for civil rights helped push the world ever closer to the brighter future that was once the stuff of science fiction.
We were going to boldly go where no one had gone before.
These are the voyages of George Takei.
Oh my.
One of George Takei's earliest memories is when the government came for his family.
We saw two soldiers marching up our driveway, and these soldiers ordered us out of our home.
It was 1942, and Japan had recently bombed Pearl Harbor. In response, President Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Army to round up people of Japanese descent living along the West Coast, with no legal recourse or protection.
It was a catastrophic event for Japanese Americans.
The Army forcibly removed over 100,000 people from their homes, citizens and non-citizens alike, and sent them to camps, what Roosevelt and other government officials called concentration camps.
We picked up what we could carry and walked out of the house. I remember tears were streaming down my mother's cheek.
George was just 5 years old. He and his family were forced to live with hundreds of other people in a swamp and to sleep in stables and shacks, while military guards watched over them like criminals.
This was a concentration camp. We were all concentrated. I could see the barbed wire fence and the sentry tower.
5-year-old George didn't fully understand what was happening. He thought it was a vacation at first. He started to think of it as normal life.
Because behind barbed wires was, for us, home.
But his parents didn't want them to think of this as normal. They refused to accept the inhumane, unjust conditions. His father started organizing the other people in the camp to advocate for better food and shelter. He led efforts to build boardwalks so they didn't have to walk through the swamp to the cafeteria every day. He became recognized as a community leader among the other people the government had incarcerated in the camp.
My father was always involved in what I thought was other people's business. He was always in meetings or projects for the community.
George didn't always understand why his dad was so busy.
As a child, I was kind of frustrated that our daddy was away so much from us.
But later, he came to understand that his father was protecting his family, not just with better food and shelter, but also by showing them how to respond to injustice, a lesson that George wouldn't fully understand until years later. The family spent 3 years in the camps, and then, when the war ended, the government sent them back to Los Angeles, with virtually no money or possessions, to start their lives from scratch. Though they were free from the camp, the unjust treatment continued. Still just a child, George often heard slurs and threats, and he saw the impact of racist laws that limited where the family was allowed to live.
I got my understanding of hate and prejudice when we came out of those internment camps.
As much as his parents tried to shield him from the worst of their treatment, even as a child, George was coming to realize that some people would always look down on him simply because of who he was.
And so I wanted to hide the fact that I was of Japanese ancestry, but I couldn't hide it.
It was around that time that he had another realization about himself. It happened one day when he saw some magazines at the far end of an LA newsstand.
There are these muscle magazines, and some of those posing straps were very brief.
And he recognized that his interests were different from the other kids.
The boys around me were saying things like, Sally is cute, but who really got me excited was Bobby.
He knew this was yet another thing that set him apart from other people. And unlike being Japanese, not only was it something that he could hide, it was something he knew he would have to for his own safety.
So I pretended. You think, is this going to be my life? Pretending that I'm something that I'm not?
Feeling the weight of being treated unfairly and having to hide who he was, there was one thing that brought him joy and provided an escape. George had always loved entertaining people. Here he is with one of his high school friends.
George was in the drama department.
One of those.
And I was in the choir.
We were the theater.
And as he got to be a teen, he decided he wanted to be an actor.
My parents thought it was absolutely crazy.
They knew how difficult this career choice would be. At the time, there weren't a lot of great roles for Asian actors. His first job was dubbing voices in a monster movie.
These rodents are reptiles, a member of the snake family.
And when it came to on-camera work, his options were particularly limited.
There were stereotypes that we were saddled with. The buffoon, the quiet servant, the enemy.
His agent pushed him to take those jobs, telling him,
If you really want to make your career ascend, you got to do some parts like this.
so he did it. But those roles ate away at him. And looking back,
I regret that. I'm sorry I did it. I don't think it really helped my career.
as he struggled to find more meaningful acting work, George knew he was in a particularly precarious position with his career.
Back in the 60s, you could not pursue an acting career if it was known that you were gay. It was suicide.
Having to stay closeted was a pretty lonely life, and he started looking for other people like him.
I remember when I first went into a gay bar, it was both a little scary and comforting.
I could make friends as who I am.
But even that, he soon learned, was dangerous.
The police would raid gay bars, and they would march the clients out, drive them to the police station, fingerprint them, photograph them, and their names would be put on a list.
Raids like those were commonplace in the 50s and 60s.
It was terrifying.
George saw the effect of those raids on other actors who had the bad fortune to be in a bar when police came in.
Their lives could be destroyed. They could lose their jobs, perhaps their families. It was a horrible thing.
So he constantly had to have his guard up and hide who he was.
It was a very uncomfortable way to live.
Being treated like a criminal simply for who he was brought George back to an earlier time in his life.
Being gay was criminalized. We were marched out and registered. And I thought, that's no different than what happened to me when I was a child. It was the same thing. And I thought that was horrible. It was wrong, unjust.
Once again, it seemed like the only future he could look forward to was one where he would be treated unfairly, that certain things about him would always be considered a liability, and that there was nothing he could do about it. His future seemed bleak. But it was around this time that he caught a glimpse of a better future. One day in 1966, George's agent told him that he was up for a different kind of role. It was on an upcoming science fiction show set on a starship called the Enterprise, full of people from all different backgrounds.
The Enterprise was a metaphor for Starship Earth, and the strength of this starship lay in its diversity.
Early on, George met with the show's creator, Gene Roddenberry, who told him about his plans.
I can't forget that day. It was very, very special. Gene explained to us what Star Trek was all about. We were each to represent different parts of the planet. And working together, we were going to boldly go where no one had gone before.
Gene wanted to use sci-fi to comment on issues of the day and to advocate for values that he believed in, like tolerance, diversity, treating people fairly. It was something George had been longing for in his own life.
And I desperately wanted that role. A couple of weeks later, my agent called to tell me that I was cast. I was overjoyed.
The show, of course, was Star Trek. It debuted on September 9, 1966, and George played Sulu, who piloted the Enterprise on a mission of peace and exploration.
To explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations.
Sure enough, the show addressed issues of the day, many of which George had first-hand knowledge of, like inequality, the terrible consequences of war, and bigotry.
There was persecution on Earth once. I remember reading about it in my history class.
Yes, but it happened way back in the 20th century. There's no such primitive thinking today.
The role was deeply meaningful to George.
For me, as an individual Asian American actor, it was a personal breakthrough. It was not a stereotyped role.
Not only was it a vision of a better future where nobody was looked down on for being different, but he got to play a character who was dignified, respected, and even got to be sexy.
I got a chance to whip my shirt off and accost everybody with my fencing foil.
And it was also meaningful to many viewers, seeing themselves reflected in a way that was all too rare.
For Asians, the image of Asians, it was a tremendous breakthrough.
There weren't many Asians on television, so when George would come on, it would be a special thing.
Recognizing how much this role meant to viewers, George wanted to do even more. One day, when Gene was having a party at his house, George took him aside.
I said, we've dealt with many controversial issues using science fiction as the metaphor, but we've not addressed the gay issue.
I was still closeted then.
Right.
So I spoke as a liberal.
George wanted Star Trek to introduce a gay character, or to at least feature a metaphor for the homophobia that gay people faced at the time. And Gene told him he wanted to, but they were in a tricky position. Just a few months earlier, the show had featured an interracial kiss, one of the first on television, and it caused an uproar.
That show was literally blacked out in the South. Ratings plummeted. It was the lowest rated episode that we had.
Gene confided in George that the show was nearly canceled over that kiss. He thought that if they tried to tackle homophobia, the show would definitely be taken off the air.
I do remember him saying, I don't think we will get to the point where we will see two men walking hand in hand down the corridors of the Enterprise.
And I understood that because I was still closeted at that time.
Clearly, society in real life was still lagging behind the utopia that Star Trek envisioned. But there were some hopeful signs on the horizon.
That summer of '69, there was a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn. It was going to be raided. Well, this time, the patrons of the Stonewall Inn weren't going to take it anymore. And when the police came in, they started throwing things at the police, and they forced the police to retreat.
It wasn't the first time queer people had resisted police harassment. There had been similar actions in California, at the Black Cat Tavern in LA 2 years earlier, and at Compton's Cafeteria in San Francisco a year before that. George, still closeted, saw those people fighting back.
It was stirring, it was inspiring, but I wanted to be an actor. I had to protect my career.
At the time, homosexuality was still a crime in California. In fact, one of the actors that George worked with on Star Trek was arrested in one of those raids, and he was outed when local newspapers printed his name and home address. So, although the character Sulu lived in a better, fairer future, George's real life still forced him to confront inequality every single day.
I faked a lot. I went to parties with beards, women, putting on a facade, which also means putting on another layer of tension.
And things got even worse for George after Star Trek ended. He found that he was so closely identified with the Sulu character that it was hard for him to find other work. Many of the roles that he was offered were a return to the old stereotypes.
I mean, these are the kind of roles that we didn't want to do.
One of his few career highlights in the early 70s was returning to the role of Sulu on Star Trek the Animated Series. But even that almost didn't happen. Producers initially hired most of the original cast to voice their characters. Bill Shatner as Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, James Doohan as Scotty, but they didn't want to hire George or Nichelle Nichols.
But when Leonard found out about that, he said, this show is about diversity. And if they can't be a part of this show, then I'm not interested in doing it. And he said he's going to walk away from it.
Leonard Nimoy forced them to hire George and Nichelle.
Well, I consider him a very good friend.
With acting opportunities still not what he wanted, George started looking at other ways that he could make a difference. And that's when he remembered something that had happened when he was a teenager, after his family left the camps. Back then, George asked his father how they could still live in a country that claimed to be founded on lofty ideals, but had treated them so poorly.
And he said, ours is a people's democracy. Our democracy is dependent on people who cherish those shining ideals and actively participate in the process. And he said, let me show you how it's got to work. He drove me downtown to the Adlai Stevenson for President campaign headquarters, and he introduced me to electoral politics.
After Star Trek, George dove into politics, first volunteering for campaigns, then serving on local committees and running for office. This was a big shift from his acting work, but he remembered what his parents had taught him.
Being an American is not just for some people. They gave me a legacy, and I am dedicated to making my country an even better America.
And so, that's what he did. Through the 70s and 80s, George split his time between acting and politics. He reprised his role as Sulu in all of the Star Trek films.
Kiwi 204, isn't it?
Right on. You fly?
Oh, here and there.
And he also served as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. He joined a project to pressure the government to address the incarceration of Japanese people during World War II, and eventually got an apology and reparations for the people who were affected.
The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors.
He also became a staunch advocate for public transit.
When I'm out in space, I use the Starship Enterprise to get around. When I'm here in Milwaukee, I ride the bus to save time and money.
And he served on a transportation commission for Southern California.
And is it true that you once had to leave the set of one of the Star Trek movies to go cast a vote?
Yeah.
And was this the pivotal vote that got a subway built in L.A.?
The publicists like to say that.
Of course, throughout this time, he still had to remain closeted for the sake of his career. Whether he was working in politics or as an actor, both were industries that were extremely hostile to queer people.
So that sort of tension in my life continued for a long, long time.
For all the good that he was able to do for other people, it seemed like George himself would always have to secretly suffer through unjust treatment for being gay, and that he'd have to do it alone.
I can't imagine what it would be like to have to hide that identity. It just seems so difficult, it's so draining and tiring and dispiriting.
But then, in 1984, he met someone who would change his life. It was at a meetup for a running group. There's a guy there named Brad who caught George's eye.
And I thought, well, how can I get to know him? I'll ask him to train me for my first marathon. And he became more than my marathon trainer.
George and Brad fell deeply in love and were inseparable. When George's mother fell ill, Brad helped take care of her.
That was a test of his love, and I'm eternally grateful, and my love for him is that much deeper.
We're family.
But because George was still working in politics and as an actor, they had to be careful.
I went back in the closet when George and I started dating because we would go to Hollywood screenings and I was always his business partner, buddy.
On one hand, it was wonderful to have a partner and to no longer feel so alone with his secrets. But on the other, there were constant reminders that they were still not treated equally. In 2004, George was among a group of people recognized by the Japanese government for their contributions to humanity. Brad accompanied George on the trip, but when they arrived for the ceremony...
The chamberlain, he said, you cannot step off the bus. It's only married couples that are allowed to come into the imperial palace. It was very unfair.
It felt horrible.
But they just didn't see what they could do about it. The unjust treatment of queer people seemed too monumental to tackle, and the utopian future envisioned by Star Trek seemed like it would always remain out of reach. Even when asked directly, George would have to deny that he was gay. Here he is on the Howard Stern show where he was a frequent guest.
You don't go that way, do you? You're not a homosexual.
Oh, no,
not with a voice like that.
Although he couldn't be fully open about his life on the Howard Stern show, George actually became a frequent guest in the 90s, and even created a popular catchphrase completely by accident.
And I said, good morning. And he says, you have a deep voice. A voice like that must have a big dong below. I asked, are we on the air? And he said, yep. And I said, oh my.
But in 2005, something changed. That year, California considered a marriage equality bill that would have legalized the recognition of couples like Brad and George and thousands of others. It just needed the signature of the governor, which at first, everyone expected to easily happen. When the bill was being planned a few years earlier, the governor was a Democrat named Gray Davis who had indicated his support. But after Davis was re-elected in 2002, Republicans bankrolled a recall election, the first in California history. And Gray Davis was replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. When Arnold campaigned, he claimed to be a supporter of queer people.
He told the public, some of my best friends are gays and lesbians. And persuaded by that, A couple of my gay friends did vote for him.
But then, when the marriage equality bill landed on his desk,
he acted as the representative of his base, the right wing of the Republican Party, and he vetoed it.
Arnold's explanation for his veto was ridiculous.
But you said you don't believe in gay marriage, and you just said now to me that you don't have a problem with it. That seems...
I don't have a problem with it. I'm against it, but I have no problem with it.
And George felt what had become a familiar reaction to injustice.
I was raging, but I had trained my body muscularly to hold in that rage.
It seemed like another sign of the inequality that he'd known all his life. But then he saw that he wasn't alone. A lot of other people were angry too.
And that night, Brad and I were watching the late night news, and I saw all these young people pouring out onto Santa Monica Boulevard, venting their rage, and we felt the same way.
Seeing everyone marching in the streets took George back to other times when he saw the power of collective action. From his dad organizing in the camps, the Stonewall riots, to his work to get reparations.
It was many, many years after Stonewall, but the same kind of inspiration came to me. Brad and I decided that we needed to speak out.
Why did this matter so much to him?
I was 68 years old by that time. And I thought, well, I want my life to have some meaning. I want the time that I have left to do something about that aspect of who we are.
And so, George and Brad made their decision.
I didn't check with my agent because I know that my agent and others would try to dissuade me.
In October of 2005, George gave an interview where he talked for the first time about who he really was.
And I blasted Arnold Schwarzenegger's veto, and it was so liberating.
But it was also a huge risk. Not only was George coming out as gay and jeopardizing his career, he was also taking on one of the most powerful people in politics and entertainment, the two industries that he worked in.
I thought my career was over. I was prepared for it.
But to his surprise,
the opposite happened.
My career, which I'd been protecting by living that double life, expanded.
Following his announcement, George experienced a career renaissance. He was everywhere. Commercials, talk shows, late night, and he continued to reprise his role on Star Trek.
Outstanding.
Of all the actors on the original series, George has now played his character for longer than anyone else.
And I said, George, our careers are over. He says, well, maybe yours.
He also got to speak openly at last on The Howard Stern Show, and even to bring Brad on with him.
Listen, the two of you are amazing. You are the couple of all couples.
At first, George's appearances on Howard Stern caused a little tension between George and Brad, especially when the conversations got a bit dirty.
He was going into areas of privacy that I wasn't sure I wanted him to do that.
But over time, Brad started to get more comfortable.
The first time we consummated our relationship sexually was at the end of the Los Angeles Marathon on March 5th.
Wow.
And in fact, those appearances wound up giving a big, unexpected boost to George's career. We don't have time for that whole story now, but I've got a bonus video over on Patreon about why Brad came around and just how revealing their appearances became. That's at patreon.com/mattbaum. One of the effects of George's heightened visibility is that he was able to advocate for equality to a much bigger audience than ever before.
What defines a marriage isn't necessarily man and a woman because of what you said.
Yeah.
It's the bond of love.
After coming out, George and Brad were able to reach a huge audience, millions of people, through radio and TV and online. They could now speak openly at last about how injustice and inequality affected them, often to audiences who might otherwise never have thought about same-sex couples.
When George speaks about homosexuality in the same way I speak about heterosexuality, it makes things normal. People are used to seeing two men together because you two are such a great couple. So George is performing a great activist duty.
And they weren't doing this alone. George and Brad joined countless people, all fighting for equality in various ways. Talking to family, marching in crowds, running for office, going to court. All of those people pushing together towards a better future. And making progress. In 2005, when George came out to protest Arnold's marriage equality veto, only one state in the country recognized the freedom to marry. But in the years that followed, public opinion shifted, new bills came along, more states started granting marriage equality, And finally, in 2015,
the Supreme Court has affirmed same-sex marriage is the law of the land.
It was a huge victory. Not only did fairness and justice expand across the country, but it also meant that finally, George and Brad could do something that they never dreamed would be possible in their lifetimes.
As we learned over the weekend, actor George Takei, Mr. Sulu from Star Trek, married his longtime partner, Brad Altman.
Over the more than 21 years, I have called you many things. I have called you my life partner, my significant other, my longtime companion, my lover.
But now you can call me husband.
Yeah.
That was one of the happiest moments in my life.
Looking back, the lesson that George learned from his parents was how to meet injustice by joining forces with others, working together to make the world better for everyone.
My father wanted to see a better America. I've considered it my mission in life to talk about social justice and equality.
And through his work, both as an actor and an activist, those became the values that he's been able to champion to millions more people.
You know, on Star Trek, we have this core value, IDIC, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And here we are, this much closer to that ideal.
There's lots more to say about George and his work and his life, like his connection to Star Wars Riverdale and both the Marvel and DC universes, or his appearance on The Twilight Zone on a controversial episode that was withheld from broadcast for decades, and why George objected to the new Star Trek films making the Sulu character gay. I'll have those stories in bonus videos over at patreon.com/mattbaum. And if you like stories about pop culture history, you'll probably enjoy my upcoming book that tracks the history of queer characters on American sitcoms, from Bewitched to The Golden Girls to Friends and beyond. It's called Hi Honey, I'm Homo. It comes out on May 23rd, 2023. Pre-orders are now open at gaysitcoms.com. Big thanks to everybody who makes these videos possible with your support. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go see if George liked my birthday present.
There was only a half-eaten muffin in a dirty freezer bag.